Hello everyone, and welcome to the demonstration video for our watercolor tonal landscape paintings. So, by now you should have some materials, or you should have an option of what material you'll be using. Here are all my materials. On this end, I have a variety of brushes in different sizes. And then right next to that, I have my watercolor pencils. In the center here are my watercolor paints. And on the very end is my watercolor paper. I have a pad with 24 sheets, 9 inches by 12 inches. And then on the side here, some extra watercolored pencils, paper towels, and a little cup with my water. I have my 2 reference sheets and a reference photo to help guide me while I work today. So all of this is what you'll need for when you start working on your own watercolor tonal landscape. I'll do the watercolors first and the watercolor pencils as well. So I'm going to grab my watercolor paper, open that up, and we're going to get started. To start, I'm going to show everybody how to begin sketching your landscape. So in this video, you're going to see me do mountain landscapes. I was inspired by Yosemite National Park on the field trip, so I have a reference photo by me of Yosemite, and I'm going to do mountains with some trees in the foreground. I'll do this multiple times in watercolor pencil and watercolor, but you'll see here I'm just lightly, very lightly, you'll want to do it even lighter than how I'm doing it, sketching a landscape here. The goal of going a little bit lighter is so that when you do your paints later, the paints don't bleed into the pencil and the graphite. So now that it's all sketched, I might map out where I want to put some trees, just with very, very light lines. And you don't have to sketch it first. You can just go straight in with the paints. In this tutorial, I'm sketching to give you a better sense of mapping out for the painting itself. So maybe you want to add a mountain within a mountain. Once you add color to it, it's going to look a lot cleaner, and those lines will hopefully not interfere with that paint. So here are my watercolor pencils, and I'm just going to quickly show you a demo for sketching if you want to do a forest landscape. So I'm starting with a trunk, and then I'm just making branches of various sizes that stem out from the trunk. So I'm going to do one tree on this page, just making lots of branches. You don't have to do it any specific way. It's very organic, so it's found in nature. So nothing is going to be man-made. So that means that it's up to you. If you want to use a reference picture and follow that, of course, that works as well. So if I was doing a forest, I would do a bunch of these trees, and as they got into the distance, they would get lighter, just as you'll see with my mountain landscapes in the video today. So I'll finish sketching out this tree, and again, sketching is optional. If it's easier for you to go straight in with the paints, you're more than welcome to work that way also, but you want to get a good base. So if you've read the directions, you know that we're supposed to be using a specific color scheme. So here I have my color wheel that we completed earlier in the project, and I have all of those definitions, and this is where those are really going to come in handy. So here's all the definitions for the color schemes. I have analogous, complementary, and then my warm and cool colors on the outside. So in this video, you'll see me do a lot of complementary color schemes. So that's those colors that are across from each other on the color wheel, and you'll get to pick your own color scheme that you want to work with. So that can be the analogous, which are next to each other on the wheel, complementary, which are across from each other, or one of those warms and cools. And here I have my watercolor paint palette, and you'll see that these colors I'm pointing to are cool colors and they're analogous colors, so I could use that for my painting if I wanted to. So before I get into starting the final demo, I'm just going to do a little bit of color mixing here on my watercolor palette. So you'll see that I'm creating a tint right now by mixing that white color with blue, and I'm going to just test that out on my paper and make sure you're using plenty of water to help make that watercolor suspend and work better on the paper. And then you can do, as we learned with our watercolor techniques, you can do a nice flat wash across the page and help to distribute that color all over your landscape. So that's what I'm doing here right now. And then I'm going to go in with a darker color the further I get down. So in the distance here, I have it the lightest. And with the paints, I'm starting in the distance since it's easier to not have colors bleed into each other. So you want to start with the lightest color first so that your colors don't end up bleeding into each other and that pigment isn't falling into the background. You want it to be the lightest in the background, so that means the littlest amount of pigment. And that pigment is what makes the color that it is. So that would be, as we learned, the word hue means the color itself. So that would be the pigment or hue of blue in my case, since I'm working with that cool color scheme that I pointed at a little bit earlier. So now you'll see that I'm going in and adding mixing up another tint. And then here is a final landscape version. So I did this one, finished it up, and I added a orange and yellow background. And then up here, that's another test I did with some analogous colors of purple and blue. Here it's complementary orange and blue. So how will you start today? What you're first going to do is, if you need to, you're going to follow the earlier steps of sketching out. In this one, I am going to lightly sketch my mountains, and I'm doing this in a vertical portrait style, unlike the last ones that I did horizontally. So I am lightly sketching out those mountains then, and once I have that done, I am going to leave lots of space for a sky, and we're going to get into painting. So I'm going to wet my brush really nice, then I'm going to grab some orange paint, because I think for this one I'll do complementary colors. So I'll do those colors across from each other on the wheel, that blue and orange. I'm going to start at the bottom with a light tint of orange, meaning I added white to this color. And I'm going to take that with a flat wash, so back and forth across the page, all one tone. I'm going to take that across the page, and I wet my paper before this, so I am also working with a wet on wet technique. So the paper's wet and my brush and paint are wet. Now I'm going to grab a more vibrant orange, so a darker shade, adding another dark color, and I'm going to go above that really light orange. And I'll do another flat wash with this. Since I'm not going into the other color quite yet, it's still a flat wash on my page. And you'll want to distribute that orange pretty evenly. It's okay to have some streaks if it's the look that you're going for. It could mean that there's clouds in your sky. I'm going to go in with the most vibrant orange at the very top for my background. And I'm going to drag that in, and now I think I'll do some glazing, so layering, and I'm going to layer more orange on top of the oranges that are already there, and then I'll take some yellows and I'll glaze them into that nice orange sky also, so it gives it a really nice sunset effect. And I'm just flat wash glazing over, and now I think I'll just add some yellow down here at the bottom, make that a little more vibrant. And once you get all of these colors mixed. If you're working with more heavier duty paper, you can keep mixing as much as the paper can withstand. If the paper's a little thinner, you're going to want to give this plenty of time to dry. Since it's wet, we're using water, it's going to take quite some time to dry. So before I let it dry, I'm going to grab my paper towel and I'm going to try to do some lifting off. So I bunched it up to make it seem like I'm doing clouds. And in the videos, we saw that this works a lot better when the paint is still wet and saturated, so it's still a little wet. But I'm making some decent clouds right now. I'm going to connect them just a little bit. So it's like I'm stamping clouds into the paper. And I think I'll smear them across so they kind of look like those nice clouds that you see in the very upper atmosphere. So there you have that background. So I have my watercolor background in the corner, and now I have my watercolor pencils out, and we're going to start working with those. So for my watercolor pencils, instead of sketching out with pencil itself, I'm actually fortunate enough to be able to sketch with the watercolored pencils. So I'm going to sketch out another mountain landscape, and this time I'm going to use the complementary color scheme of purple and yellow. So first I'm taking that purple color and just doing a sketch of that mountain landscape in the purple, and you'll want to do it lighter in the background and darker in the foreground. So light back in that back area and pretty dark in the very front. And I did mine all pretty dark so that you could see them. So I'm going to work on the background. For tonight, you don't want to shade and paint the mountains themselves. We're just working on sketching out and backgrounds. So you'll see where I painted that mountainscape in later in the video. For now, we're going to skip to that background. So I am using purple's complement of yellow, and I'm just going to press hard with my pencil and make a gradient in my sky. So with my watercolor paints, you saw that I had it a little bit lighter at the bottom, and I used nice dark lines to create a contrast in the sky and make it seem like a sunset. So I'm trying to accomplish the same effect by using that gradient method, so light to dark, with my yellow colored pencil. And then once I have that completely shaded in, here I am going over top of that with my water to help blend. So you'll see all those lines are going to soften out as soon as I get the water on there and activate the watercolored pencil, so it becomes a more paint-like solution instead of pencil. So once I get that complete, I'm going to start working on those mountains now with my watercolored pencils. So just as I talked about with your sky, you're going to do a gradient with this also. So you'll see that I'm lightly shading in the background, and as I get closer to the front of my drawing, the foreground, I'm going a little bit darker with each chain of mountains. So lightest in the back is what I start with, since once we start activating our paint, we're going to spread that water across, and you're going to want the least amount of pigment with that last mountain, especially with the atmospheric perspective, which we learned about, with mountains getting softer and more bluish gray in the distance. You want to accomplish this effect by having the gradient, so those lights to darks. So my darkest color I shade in right now in the very front or the foreground of my picture. And it's okay with watercolored pencils if those lines show, like we talked about with our background video, because now as I take my water, you'll watch as the watercolored pencil smears across the page and makes a watercolor effect. So it's being activated and the pigment's spreading really nicely. Pretty dark up in the foreground here. So I'm trying to get those nice lines where the mountains connect while blending out my color And then I'm going to continue to do the same thing with each of my different mountain chains, spreading around that color and making sure that it looks very gradiated. Now if you mess up on your gradients, something's not as dark as you wanted it to be once you activate it with the water, you can always let it dry first. You want it to be dry so those pencils don't tear the paper or cause indents, and then you can just go back in with your colored pencil. So unlike the paint where you would just dip your brush back into the paint and add more, once it's dry, you'll just draw back on top with your colored pencil once it's dry. So watercolor pencils are similar to the watercolor paints, but not quite the same. Some of the methods and techniques are just a little bit altered. So now I'm just going to finish up in the very background with that nice light purple, and you'll see that I had dabbed my brush on my paper towel up in the corner. You want to make sure you're not bringing much pigment into this top mountain chain. So it might work better if you start with the mountain chain in the very far back first, but I started with the foreground just to see if I could get some of that pigment to blend as a gradient more. I know we saw in the video carrying out the gradient from a really dark front to a really light back is one of the techniques you can use with watercolor. So I thought I'd give that a try. So now I'm just going in and making sure my brush marks look even and matched up. And then I'll have my mountain chain. So now I'm going to show you how to complete the mountain chain with our watercolor paint palette. So you'll see that I'm starting, as I said earlier in the video, with the mountain chain in the very back first. Since you don't want too much pigment to be on the brush or carry over into these mountain chains or background objects. If you're doing trees, you wouldn't want it to carry into those trees. If you're doing more of a canyon, you wouldn't want it to carry into that canyon. A canyon would be very similar to mountain chains, though. It would just be nice block shapes, and they would probably be orange rather than blue, but as long as it fits a color scheme, that can be completely up to you. Just have to choose one color scheme for this project. So you'll see that I'm doing complementaries with my demonstrations, but if I wanted to, I could have done my sky blue. Then I would have had a monochromatic color scheme, which we talked about with our color wheels, and that's the light to dark tints and shades color scheme of just one color. So I'm doing the very lightest mountain chain in the back, then I'm going to glaze over the one I just did because I want that to be a little bit darker than the one that I did in the very back. So I let that dry and layer another color on it, which we know is glazing from our watercolor techniques. Now I'm going to go to the next color, and that's going to be a little bit darker. If it bleeds into the other mountains, what's nice about watercolors is that we've talked about how you can layer them really nicely. So here I'm not doing a wet on wet technique like I did with my background, which we talked about. I'm just doing a regular wet on dry technique. So I'm doing a wet on dry flat wash. So I'm just adding lots of extra paint and lots of extra water to my brush to cover that space. And really blending that out on my page. And then I'm going to grab my very darkest blue, and I'm going to get that mountain in the very front, the foreground, and that one's going to be the darkest. So in the beginning of the video, when I showed some color mixing techniques with the side of my palette, if you want your mountains to be monochromatic, or if you don't have the big color palette with all the different shades and tints, you would just add black to the foreground, mix that up on the side, and do that for the darkest. And then for the lightest, you would make a tint by adding white. And this is where that color wheel, where we wrote those definitions and did the gradients and filled in the wheel itself, that's where that'll come out really handy. So you have a reference point for creating your tints and shades, a reference point for choosing your color scheme that you're going to work with, and a reference point for mixing those colors if you had an opportunity to mix colors with your color wheel. So I'm just touching this up and finishing that last block, and now we're going to add some details. So I've sat this and let it dry, and you'll see it's curving up a little bit. I'm going to start by trying to blow a tree. Now this didn't work too well for me. Maybe it worked for you when you tried it with your techniques exercises. So for me, I'm just going to go right over this tree with some brown paint, and if it's not dark enough, again, just mix it with a little bit of black. So I'm going to dip mine into some water, and I'll do a black-brown mix, and watch how the paper just absorbs that paint right up, and I'm just going to keep going back over that with my brown and black paint and making sure that looks dark enough. So I'll do that a few times just to show you how I'm getting that nice branch for the tree. I'll add a few more branches here and just a little bit more color onto each of those branches, just to use as an example. Now you can do trees all like this, or you maybe want to try an evergreen or a pine tree, so I'll do a little demonstration of that. And for this one, I'm just going to do a very dark trunk for the center, and then I'm going to wet my brush. I'll choose a finer tipped brush for this, since you'll want to get pretty precise lines for your branches if you're doing that evergreen tree. So I'm just going to go downward motion with my brush and make the branches for that tree. So maybe you want to try out both trees. Maybe you just want to do one tree. I'm doing 2 trees just to show you how they're each done. And if I wanted to, I could add some dark leaves onto my tree that doesn't have leaves right now. So that's an option for you as well. And then once I've done this, adding in this tree, I'm going to darken it to my liking, and I might add some blue, since that foreground would still be blue, so it doesn't have to be just black. It's going to be more of a shade of blue. So I'll go in and add those details into the tree, and once that tree is done, I think I'm going to do a little bit of a dry brush technique, which we learned makes good grass textures in your watercolor paintings. So I dried it with my paper towel, and now I am separating the bristles of the brush, and I'm going to dip it into some paint, separate those bristles again, make sure it's pretty dry, but it still has enough pigment. And I'm going to just see that texture and how that works on my paper. Maybe make some grass and put that next to my trees in the very foreground. And I'll carry that across the rest of the page. So here's another option for getting details in your piece. And if you wanted to and you had a pretty big mountain in your foreground, you could do this on the mountains as well to add some grass and add some texture to those. So I'm going to finish up adding that texture, and then I'm going to move on to my watercolor pencils. So I'm going to show you real quick how to make the same effect of very foreground trees or grass, but with your watercolored pencils. So I'm taking a purple watercolored pencil, and I'm pressing very, very hard on my page with my purple pencil to make that tree. And you can do this with just the purple, or you can do it with the darkest color you have. So I might change over to using my black pencil and layering that on top of my purple. So we watched in the watercolor pencil tutorial video, we watched about how you can mix different colors with watercolor pencil just like you would with watercolored paint. So I'm doing downward motions on my tree. I'm just going to make this an evergreen, so one of those nice green fir trees. And it's basically what you're creating is, since it's a tonal landscape, it's not as detailed as a regular landscape. So basically you're making the silhouette of the tree in the foreground with both the pencils and the paints. So now for grass, since I don't necessarily use a dry brush, I'm just going to make those marks there. And then you'll go over this. Try to use a fine-tipped brush because the watercolor pencils, once the paint is activated by the water, it's going to smear just a little bit on the paper. So a finer tipped brush to get those precise lines wet that you drew is going to be a little bit better to work with. Going to look a little cleaner and better. And then I'll just do the same with my grass. I'll spread out that with my water and then blend a little bit into that mountain. And now you can do this across the whole page. You don't have to do it how I did with just one tree. Maybe you want to add a few trees. I'm also going to add another detail. I might add a sunset into my sky. So I'm going to use orange, and then I'm going to blend that orange with my water into my yellow sky. So I've got some warm colors going on up top, and then I've got some cool monochromatic purple tones at the bottom, and all in all, everything's a nice complementary color scheme. So you can add a lot more to these paintings. Don't go off of just what I did. Here's one where it's in a landscape with lots of trees, and then I have my demos up at the top. So thank you for joining me for the demonstration on your tonal landscapes. I look forward to seeing them. Here's one example again, and good luck with everything. Let me know if you have any questions or need any help, and I hope that you're using lots of different color schemes and just having fun working with the watercolored paints and filling in those nice details. So thank you, good luck.